Leech is the single biggest problem to face Marvel Snap. But is he really? What the fuck? So as I'm sure all of you already know by this point, the entire Snap community is in a unanimous uproar in defiance against Leech. Now, Leech is a very interesting card and one that I find to be necessary to the game of Marvel Snap. But let's talk about why people want Leech nerfed and potentially out of the game entirely. Leech is, of course, a 5/3 card found in Pool 2 that says, on reveal, remove all abilities from every card in your opponent's hand. Now, this is very impactful for a lot of players because there are, in the nature of Snap, plenty of cards that are very impactful on turn 6. Leech's role in the game is to inhibit and prevent these super splashy plays over and over again, and in the words of Glenn Jones, to actually encourage deck diversity where not every single person is playing the same type of deck. But what happens when everyone's deciding that you need to play Leech to get ahead? Well, this isn't the first time we've seen Leech in the past. We actually saw Leech paired with the other green guy that everyone hated, Leader. And the biggest problem with Leader was the fact that it was extremely one-sided and had the potential to swing games when you were already entering a winning position on turn 6. Does it sound like someone? Leech doesn't quite have that same level of impact. Leech typically wants a deck that has the ability to make their own plays on turn 6, because of Leech, of course, being a 5/3 is not very impactful from a power perspective. Now, of course, the removing of abilities from your opponent's hands does cause the detriment to a plethora of decks, if not every deck in Marvel Snap. The exception being perhaps Shuri Zero, with cards like Red Skull being the main reason for that. Though hitting a Taskmaster or an Artem Zola when the Red Skull is typically already on board, coming on turn 5, is fairly impactful in its own right. So let's look at the first reason of why people find this card to be incredibly unfun. That's the key word here. It is an unfun card. In game balance, when it comes to any game, whether it's a card game, a competitive game of any variety, does come down to player enjoyment first and foremost. Glenn Jones himself even stated that player enjoyment and the funness of a game for them is more important than the overall balance structure of the game entirely, which I don't fault them for, and I think that's the appropriate way to go about it. If you have an incredibly balanced game in terms of win percentages and the amount of times cards are played, etc., but it does feature a lot of these unfun characteristics of the game, people are going to be less inclined to return and continue playing, which means a loss of player base, a loss of money, etc. Of course, you want to make sure the game is fun. But why is Leech unfun? Well, Leech, of course, taking away the abilities of the cards in your hand, unless you're playing Patriot with Patriot already on board, that's pretty bad for most decks, especially when you look at the Marvel Snap Zone tier list, and pretty much any tier list you look at, or any data structure you want to take a look at for what the best cards in decks are, a lot of them have these big splashy turn 6 plays. And that's where Leech is a little bit of an interesting conundrum, because on one hand, he's incredibly unfun because no one likes having their cards essentially turned off in their hand to make it so that their plays don't do anything, and the entire aspect of why you play certain cards in your decks, whether it's a good deck or not, it could just be cards that you really enjoy playing, having them removed effectively from your hand and offer really no value besides the power output that they potentially could have. It sucks. But then on the other hand, Leech stops these from being the overabundant decks in Marvel Snap. But does he really, though? Now, if we look at the decks over at the Marvel Snap Zone tier list, like I just mentioned, you can see nearly every single deck on this tier list features huge splashy plays on turn 6. Lockjaw Thanos is an interesting example, and of course, with Lockjaw in play, they can easily cheat out a lot of things very early. But typically, Thanos decks do want to still get that last output of power on the final turn, whether it's by shoving a stone over on top of Lockjaw and trying to flip into something big, or make an impactful play with a Shang-Chi or an arrow to divert your opponent's plays away to another location to guarantee the win of the two you have already pulled ahead. So while Thanos Lockjaw isn't a very typical version of this big splashy turn 6 play, it does of course have some of the most potential of these types of plays due to the flexibility and the nature of the deck in itself. Shuri Zero is another one, of course. There are often times where you see a Shuri player play Shuri on turn 4 and then actually pass on 5 to be able to go into a She-Hulk arrow play to double up the She-Hulk and then arrow away everything else. Leech does stop against that. And then in the traditional sense, it does stop other things like Arnim Zola or Taskmaster as well if it comes down on turn 5. So this is definitely also impactful. Lockjaw Thor is another one because oftentimes you see Lockjaw players with Thor, they will typically go Jane Foster on 5, get their 0-cost cards in hand, and especially when they get Mjolnir in hand, if you were to leech that, yes, they do get a 0-cost along with Wasp, theoretically, to go ahead on top of Lockjaw and make plays in that way, but they do lose on the 6+ power given to Thor, which can make or break the entire game for that deck. Of course, Galactus is an interesting one because typically Galactus is trying to make it out on board prior to turn 6. Usually you see a wave on turn 3 into Galactus, or an Electro to have Galactus come on turn 5 even. But the interesting thing is lately we're seeing Galactus take this Nimrod approach, which wants to have Galactus on turn 6, so that variety of deck actually gets shut down by Leech pretty effectively, at least in the Galactus style and that game plan. Then of course, anything with Zabu is going to have the potential to play at least 2 4-cost cards on turn 6, which could be a Darkhawk and a Rock Slide, or if you already have Darkhawk on board, it could be a Rock Slide Absorbing Man, things like that to really push the power over top. That's definitely something to keep in mind. And of course, the classic, most pivotal example of a splashy turn 6 play is Deathwave. Deathwave, of course, is infamous for its wave on 5 into She-Hulk Arrow Death on 6. Leech completely shuts that down. This is a good thing to be shutting down these types of decks because arguably these decks are just as, if not worse, than Leech himself. So let's look at a few ways we could fix Leech. My favorite example and my favorite suggestion that I've seen for Leech to get a sort of nerf, I wouldn't really call this a nerf, I'd call it more of a rework in a sense. It is still a 5/3 and its ability is the exact same, but it has the caveat of for the next turn. That's pretty important because the biggest complaint about Leech is looking at turn 4 Leech, and specifically Lockjaw Thanos style decks to be able to cheat him out thanks to the Time Stone and then drop him on top of Lockjaw on turn 4 and then swap out the negative side of Leech, which is that 3 power for 5 energy, into potentially high rolling into something like Magneto or Infinite or whatever big thing you're playing in your Lockjaw Thanos deck, all the while you're still disrupting your opponent's hand. But if you make it so it only lasts for a turn, sure, you can still Leech on turn 4, but it only shuts them down for turn 5. Now, of course, it is worth noting that I think that this is still an option that is perfectly fine for a lot of decks, because if I were to Leech you on turn 4 and only shut you down on turn 5, that gives me the chance to actually make use of my plays, and it might encourage my opponent to simply pass on turn 5. Unless they have something like a Maximus where you want to have that great power output and you don't have to make me draw any cards, they might be inclined to hold on to some of those cards to wait until turn 6 comes around where their abilities are granted back. This gives me, as the Leech player in this instance, to actually fortify my side of the board on turn 5, and then, of course, potentially go into an arrow on turn 6 to just close it out. Does this still mean there's still a big issue with Leech? maybe, but I think this is one of the better options I've seen recommended. There's been a bunch of other ones as well. Some people have gone as far to make him a 2/3 instead of a 5/3 that just essentially does the same thing as Iceman, but removes the ability of a single card in your opponent's hand. I don't like this particularly at all, because then we have to face the facts of turn 6 big giant plays again. Now, of course, we want to look at real quick the numbers behind Leech. Now, Leech is, of course, boasting, if you look at Snap.fan, a pretty low play percentage when looking at the entirety of Marvel Snap. That's all collection levels, all ranks, everything. Every single person that has opted into Snap.fan, you're looking at around a 14% play rate of Leech. But if you change some of the numbers, like say make the ranks 80 to 100, and then the collection level only 3,000 and up, Leech jumps up to a whopping 37.18%. And on top of that, Leech also has a 57% win rate when drawn, and then a 60% win rate when played. Now, this does beg the question of a couple things. Yes, you can look at that blanketly and say, wow, 37% play rate is absolutely insane. And of course, a 60% win rate when he's played is ridiculous. Well, there's two things I want to point out real quick. One, Leech is being seen in the number one played deck in Marvel Snap right now, Thanos Lockjaw. And it does beg the question of, is Leech the problem in that deck, or is it things like Lockjaw, Timestone, Quinjet, etc., that are actually propelling him into this great slot to be an amazing tech card to counter pretty much any deck in Marvel Snap at the moment? That's one thing. The other thing is the win rate could be a little bit skewed. I don't know about you, but if I've ever watched someone play Marvel Snap, whether it's in person, on stream, on a YouTube video, regardless, and they go against Leech, there's that little bit of saltiness more often than not that comes through pretty quickly. And these are the people that are supposed to have a bit more composure because they play the game for a living and they're making entertaining content. The average person might get leeched and have this shared sentiment of saltiness, but just retreat immediately. I, for one, as someone who's been playing quite a bit of Lockjaw Thanos, and of course playing Leech, I've noticed a lot of people instantly retreating, whether it's Leech on turn 4 or turn 5. And that does beg the question, are they correct to retreat? Are they retreating because I completely ruined their entire game plan and I actually effectively shut down their deck? Or are they retreating because they're salty that Leech was played in general, and it's just one of those kind of retreats where they're just kind of, I'd rather go to the next game than try to maneuver around this? There's merit to both sides, of course. I think Leech does have a genuine impact on plenty of decks and can actually win games quite a bit, but I've also lost plenty of games where I have played Leech on 4 or 5 and my opponent still had the correct power output on 6 to best me overall. It's not a blanket thing of it's a guarantee win. I think it's very possible that I could argue at least around 5 to 10% of the win rate presented in Leech when played, of that 60% that we see in ranks 3,000 or up in collection level and 80 to 100 in its rank, could result from just tilted saltiness overall response to Leech. And I don't think that's something that's really all that far-fetched to consider or even present, because Leech is a salt-inducing card, and people have already been incredibly outspoken to make that known for the last few months, especially going back looking at the Leech leader fiasco from a few months back. But let's say that Second Dinner goes in a direction where they decide to nerf Leech in such a way that causes it to be a leader fiasco all over again. Leader, of course, going from a 6-4 to a 6-3, then a 6-7, and then essentially being unplayable in his current state as a 6-7 because of the very narrow scope of what his ability does now. If they do something similar to Leech, where does that leave us in the current meta? Well, there aren't very many other plays in Marvel Snap to really deter against these really big splashy turn 6 plays. It's honestly Sandman, and in a lesser sense, Arrow. Those are your main options when it comes to stopping your opponent in their tracks. Is this a good thing? I'm not quite sure. And of course, yes, you can argue Shang-Chi, you can argue Cosmo Armor in very contextual environments, depending on the decks you're playing against, to stop what they're doing in that way as well. But it's nowhere near as close as a blanket answer like Leech is to have it really make the list of true options on turn 5 to withhold your opponent from what they're doing. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with a lot of these decks. I can tell you first and foremost that Thanos Lockjaw in its current state, if it loses Leech and becomes a cuttable card, there are so many other options to just throw in to just excel their game plan and continue making the deck function in the highest form that it wants to. It is the most flexible deck in Marvel Snap because the flexibility of the stones with Quinjet, with Lockjaw itself, it gives so much room for the deck to maneuver in any way, shape, or form it really wants to. And losing Leech, of course, takes away some of its quote-unquote easy wins, but it doesn't deter the deck from being a competitive deck at the end of the day. So I can tell you right off the bat, that deck is going to stay around and just find something else to throw in at the 5-drop slot. They can go back to Devil Dino. I loved the pivot to Devil Dino in those decks to go and just say, all right, sometimes I don't have Lockjaw early, or the way my opponent's playing, this is going to devolve into a Devil Dino game and use the stone to keep my hand size full and win in that way as well. They can definitely do that. Shuri Zero, no change there. Any variety of Sarah decks. And of course, let's keep in mind, around the corner, we do have Hitmonkey as the next season pass, which is going to be a shoe-in in bounce style decks, and of course, Sarah Miracle style decks. 2 decks that Leech would do pretty damn well against, considering they want to play Hitmonkey on turn 6, along with 2 or 3 demons, or any plethora of 2-drops to beef up their Angela or their Bishop on board. You'll probably see that deck a lot as well in the coming month if Leech is hit in this hypothetical scenario. Of course, Electro Sandman Ramp is still a very prevalent deck and would be in this idea as well because of 2 reasons. One, Leech is hit, so Sandman has to take the spot of Leech. That's going to raise the stock of that deck quite a bit. And of course, that's a deck that didn't really want to get Leech too much either. Getting rid of a lot of their 6-drops does hurt them because let's say they go Doctor Doom on 5 to go into that early, and their plan is to Odin or Arnim Zola or something like that. You leech them, and they can't. And now they're just stuck with what? 5, 7, and 10 in their lanes, most likely, if they're going into the Electro Sandman 6-drop kind of play. Leech stopped that pretty well. You're not going to be able to have that option any longer if Leech is gone. Of course, Bayro will run rampant all over again because it is by far the best splashy turn 6 play that you can be doing in Marvel Snap. No ways about it. Oh, and by the way, Arrow is going to be everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. And the thing is, she already is. She's already everywhere. But think about this. All the decks that are playing Leech at the 5-drop slot lose Leech. And if they're not already running Arrow, who are they going to run to in turn 2 to that 5-drop slot? Arrow. Leech getting nerfed into oblivion is a much bigger issue and something I don't want to see happen than everyone is letting on. I hope they go with a way to nerf Leech that is appropriate and not the leader route of absolutely gutting and killing a card that we so desperately need in the Marvel Snap meta. Because if he's gone, there's nothing to stop these big splashy turn 6 plays. And sure, those are more fun, especially with you as the controller. But I would argue they're also just as salt-inducing to lose to than Leech is. But hey, that's just me. Let me know what you guys think down below in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe. It means a lot to me to have your support. We're getting close to 100 subscribers, so it would really mean a lot to get there pretty soon. And I do have some surprises in store for 100, some giveaways, things like that. I want to keep this rolling. I want to start doing more videos like this in general. But of course, what do you think? Do you think Leech is too good? Do you think he needs to be nerfed into absolute oblivion, like these examples of him becoming a completely different card, like a 2/3 Iceman type of an effect? Or do you think he's necessary? How would you change him? What do you think Marvel Snap would devolve into if Leech is gone from the metagame? As always, thank you. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time.